Good morning. My name is Craig Wansink. I'm the Joan T. Megan F. Brock Jr. Director of the Robert Nusbaum Center here at Virginia Wesleyan. The Robert Nusbaum Center brings together people of diverse perspectives for civil discussions about challenging issues. This year, I think one of our favorite quotations has been a quotation from Bill Bullard. I love this quotation. He says, "Opinion is really the lowest form of human knowledge. It requires no accountability, no understanding. The highest form of knowledge, according to George Eliot, is empathy, for it requires us to suspend our egos and live in another's world. It requires profound, purpose larger than self kind of understanding." The Nusbaum Center aims to help people see beyond their worldview and look through new lenses to help them see more clearly the ways in which others experience the world. We are just so pleased to welcome Christy Coleman as the center's annual Catharine Cookson Lecturer. Dr. Cookson, Catharine Cookson, served as the first full-time director of the Robert Nusbaum Center, formerly the Center for the Study of Religious Freedom. She served from 1998 until her untimely death in 2004. Catharine was a great person. She was a trailblazer. She focused on building bridges between the campus and the community and among diverse faith traditions. She launched the Nexus Interfaith Dialogue series, which remains one of the center's hallmark programs, continuing in partnership with the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities and Hands United Building Bridges. And we are so pleased to welcome members of Catharine's family here today. I'd now like to introduce Virginia Wesleyan University Associate Professor of History, Dr. Kathleen Casey, to the podium to introduce our 2021 Catharine Cookson Lecturer. Dr. Casey's taught at Virginia Wesleyan for 9 years. She earned her PhD from the University of Rochester, and her teaching and research focus on so many of the areas that we're fortunate to hear about today. Dr. Casey.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming. On behalf of the Robert Nusbaum Center and the Virginia Wesleyan community at large, we are very happy to have here with us today Christy Coleman. Christy Coleman is a native of Williamsburg, Virginia, who earned her bachelor's and master's degrees from Hampton University, where she focused on museum studies. Her career actually began while she was still a college student when she served at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation as a living history interpreter, which is tough work outside, especially in the summer. She went on to become the foundation's director of African American interpretations and presentations. With a career spanning over 30 years, Christy Coleman has served as the chief executive officer of some of the nation's most prominent museums. She is a tireless advocate for the power of museums, narrative correction, diversity, and inclusiveness. Ms. Coleman is an innovator and leader in the museum field, having held leadership roles at Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit, the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, and now as the executive director of the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. As president of the Civil War Museum, Coleman helped to reshape conversations of how the Civil War is discussed. It is the nation's first museum to explore the story of the Civil War from 3 perspectives: Union, Confederate, and African American. In her current role as director of the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, Ms. Coleman is continuing the process of telling a more comprehensive story of American history, focusing again on the intersection of English, African, and Native cultures in early Virginia and their impact on modern America. She is the author of numerous articles, is an accomplished screenwriter, public speaker, and has appeared on several national news and history programs. Ms. Coleman is the recipient of numerous awards for her decades of impactful work. For example, in 2018, Time magazine named her one of the 31 people changing the South, And in 2019, Worth magazine named her one of 29 women changing the world. Please join me in welcoming Christy Coleman as the Robert Nusbaum Center's annual Catharine Cookson Lecturer.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for the invitation to come to Virginia Wesleyan again. Some of you may have been with me when I was here right before the pandemic, and that was a wonderful opportunity. So when I got the invitation to come back, I said, of course. And then I said, well, what do you want me to talk about this time? And boy, did they throw out the kitchen sink. So I know what your program says, and we are certainly going to cover those things today. But I was trying to figure out how to do all of this in roughly 40 minutes so that we also have time for Q&A, because I always enjoy that element. So here we are. How shall we remember correcting the narrative? And we're going to start off with this, what I like to call the scene heard round the world. Now, there may be some of you in the audience who have no idea what this scene is or what movie it's from. If you know what scene this is and where it's from, yell it out. Black Panther, Marvel Comics, Marvel MCU, more correctly, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Black Panther film. This is the, can't even really call him the antagonist, right? But the villain, the antagonist of the film, is a character named Eric Killmonger. And this scene is Eric in a museum. And Eric has his eye on one of these objects that he intends to steal for a very specific purpose. And as he is having the conversation with the curator who shows up, all, knowledgeable, to tell him about the object, and he says, well, no. And actually, he says, I want that one. And she says, well, they're not for sale. And he goes, like you got this stuff by asking. Right? And so for those of us in the museum community that also happen to be major Marvel geeks, okay, I mean, I am. That's my side thing, is that I absolutely am actually I love it all. Sci-fi, superheroes, I love it all. I'm DC and Marvel. So, but anyway, this image spoke volumes about how we remember, how we acquire as museums, and the stories that are used when we are displaying it. And so I decided that today I was going to start with this image to give us something to really think about. How, whether intentional or not, and more often than not, it is intentional in terms of the narratives that we tell. When we think about American history, it is the story of the 13 colonies that decide to become free, and they rebel against the British Crown and King George, and woohoo, 7 years later, we are a new nation. Right? Well, here's the thing. The United States, as we know her, is really, from her beginning, a nation of exceptional diversity. Because even as the nation expands, we are coming into territories that were held first, of course, by indigenous nations that were coming up against that clash. Sometimes treaty, sometimes peaceful, oftentimes not. Other European nations were certainly on the North American continent, and we tend to forget their impact in terms of forming culture and identity of Americanness, what will become Americanness. I mean, my Lord, the Spanish were in Florida since 1565. And we talk about Jamestown in 1607. The first Africans arriving in North America is not at Jamestown in 1619, but rather in St. Augustine in 1580s. But you see, because we have, I could say, a more British-centric perspective of the American past and the way that we've told it, we've left out large swaths of American identity. Large swaths of what has impacted us. Large swaths that explain why we are not British light. You with me? Okay. That's why I love this scene so much. Because it is a fuller exploration of a lot of very complex ideas. And since I was asked to talk about slavery as one of the three big things in there, that, along with what happened with indigenous nations, is another defining characteristic. Yes, slavery existed throughout world history in different forms over different times among different peoples. Yeah, we got that. What most people do not choose to recognize or know is that what happened on these shores, what happened in the Western Hemisphere, is the largest forced migration in the history of mankind. What made American slavery so distinctly different is that it was generational, in that there was very little recourse for gaining one's freedom, and, well, frankly, it failed. Well, actually, it didn't fail. It did a great job in getting us subconsciously to believe that African peoples, and I say peoples because just like indigenous peoples, there were a lot of different ethnicities, a lot of different tribes and groups and empires and kingdoms that are existing on a continent that today has 55 different countries and over 1,000 different ethnic groups, and yet we say England and Africa, as if it's one thing. As if African peoples were just sitting on a rock in the middle of the wood, trying to make fire, waiting for white people to show up, to either give them Jesus or civilization. The problem with that narrative is the historical record is very clear. What's the problem with that narrative is it was created to justify an unjust system. The image that I'm showing you here, and I'm sorry it's not as clear as I would like, but this is an image drawn by Europeans coming upon an African kingdom. This is actually Benin City in the 1300s. Does that look like black people sitting on a rock waiting for white people to show up? But most Americans have never seen these types of images because it contradicts the narrative that was important for so long in this country. Even before the transatlantic slave trade, African peoples were interacting and trading with Europeans, which is part of the reason why when the transatlantic slave trade begins, the level of illness and death and sickness is considerably less than what Native Americans encountered because they had been doing it for over 1,000 years, the trade with Europe and the African continent. So the epidemiological issues were not as nearly as severe. These images are from the 12th through the 15th centuries. How many of you, raise your hand if you have never seen these images before? You think that's a problem? Because they are readily available. All you got to do is Google. This one of the great kingdoms. This is an image, This is an image of, an early image of Mansa Musa. Some of you may have heard of him. He was considered the wealthiest man on the planet. He had a massive kingdom, rich in gold, salt, spices, and so forth. 14th, 15th century. But, lo and behold, with the transatlantic slave trade, well, a racial construct had to be developed. Now, it was one thing for the English to think that they were superior to the French, or the Spaniards to think that they were superior to the Italians, or the Hausa to think that they were superior to the Ibibio. But the idea of a racial construct, a hierarchy of man, is among the newer things in world human history. And it was destructive, and it was pervasive, and we deal with its impacts around the world to this day. And once the transatlantic slave trade is entrenched, not only in British North America, it is Spanish America, it is French America, it is Dutch, it is German, it is virtually every European power by the 18th century is involved in the transatlantic slave trade. The trafficking of human beings to a fate of servitude for life and their heirs forever. That was the intent. And the justifications of this global racial construct as it was going on was that whiteness, because that was a construct. Before it was you were either French or you were British or you were Irish or you were Italian or you were Roman, whatever, right? You were tied to your nation, and it was not tied to one's skin tone. But this was something else. And so with it, art started to reflect an idyllic lie about what slavery was. Happy slaves, working, civilized. Look at that image. It's extraordinary. Or this one. An idealized past, not rooted in reality at all. But with the Age of Enlightenment, which also in some ways reinforced the racial construct, and in other ways greatly challenged this idea, especially slavery, the idea of rights of man, right? As those ideas are taking root, there are groups of people who around the world, and particularly in Europe, started to question this. And of course, you have the resistance and rebellion of the enslaved populations themselves, which occur basically from the beginning. There are resistance and rebellion to this institution. Can you imagine showing a slave auction this way? This is the Dutch Antilles. But again, you see this idyllic view of it. But the abolitionists said, oh, no, that's not what we're seeing. Artists that actually were going into areas and exploring this in ways were seeing things they could not imagine, horrors they could not imagine, and started to document it in art. But these are not the images that would show up in our museums. In the collection, but rarely on display. And then there's the Civil War. So you realize I just had to jump 150 years, right? Because y'all want so much. I'm good, but you know. So anyway, actually I'm going to back up just a little bit because I got to fill in some years here. All right, so we come out of the 18th century, we're a new nation, and there's something really remarkable that happens during the American Revolutionary period. And like I said, this idea of rights of man that influences the Declaration of Independence and its language is really an extraordinary piece. And African Americans seize on that, as do Native peoples and others. Like, wait a minute. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. I mean, you keep going through it, and there's some other things that are not so pleasant, like referring to native peoples as savages and so forth and so on. But it's a really radical idea that's going to be the basis of our burgeoning national identity, not individual colonies, because each of the colonies have a very different perspective. We have a slave economy that has established itself in the South, in the southern colonies, and we have colonies with slavery, i.e. New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, etc. And with this new idea, this radical new idea of rights of man and government seated in the people, the colonies that had slavery, but again, not slave economies, there is a difference, determined to abolish slavery. And this creates the first compromise as well as conflict in the new nation. It was much easier to either go gradual emancipation or outright abolition of slavery for a now state that just has slavery versus a slave economy. In the South, where wealth is highly concentrated, oligarchical societies, and had been since, well, the Stuart monarchy actually set it up that way. Wealth highly concentrated. But the aspirations of wealth, well, that always equated to slaveholding. So by the time we get fast forward through the early conflicts, fast forward to, say, everything from the Whiskey Rebellion to Washington's farewell address, where he is warning his new nation that your sectionalism may kill us over this issue. And we get to the Jacksonian period, which I know some historians don't like to refer to it as the Jacksonian period anymore. I get it. I'll do better the next time. Leading up to the American Civil War and everything from nullification crisis to the Missouri Compromise and Bleeding Kansas, and I mean just one thing after another about rights of man and the inconsistency of slavery in this society that has made America exceptionally wealthy. The 11 southern states that will leave the United States controlled 90% of the world's cotton market. It had the 6th largest economy in terms of its gross income of any nation when they seceded. It is an economy that was supported by banking in the North, insurance companies, shipping companies, you name it. This was a national thing. It just so happened that those who were enslaved were in the South. But it was a national enterprise. There was more wealth in human beings than the railroads, the banks, are you listening to me? Combined. So, states' rights? No. The South did not consider it a state right. In fact, got downright ornery when states like Pennsylvania and Delaware, especially Pennsylvania and New York and Massachusetts, said we are not going to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. If runaways make it to us, they are free people. That was their state's decision. The South were like, well, no! Federal law! Enforce it! And yet, the fear and the concern, even though the South had been given an from the beginning of the Constitution, Southern states, slave society states in particular, had been given an unfair advantage by the Three-Fifths Compromise. Three-Fifths Compromise didn't have anything to do with only counting black people as 3/5 of a human being. Stop it. It was about giving white Southern political power so that every enslaved person, 3/5 of their person would be counted for representation, which meant that the South, because of that, the slave societies of the South controlled national politics at an unequal rate for the first 80 years of our nation. Did you know that? But let's just talk about the Civil War. It's definitely about slavery. And, we hear all these other things, constitutional crisis, states' rights, la, 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 la. And we know how people voted, 4 political parties during the election of 1860. And we often see maps that look like this that break out whether they voted for the Republican Lincoln, who was the new party and the new idea of holding slavery where she existed and not allowing it to go further, that also had a radical wing of its party that wanted not only abolition but outright citizenship and voting rights for every person. Like, Thaddeus Stevens was considered an absolute lunatic because he believed in that. So this idea of, you got to take them as the people of their time. People of their time also were seriously questioning this. But I like this map better. This is looking at voting in every county, and you can see it is not as cut and dry, that people absolutely weren't in one party or another, or the whole state was behind it. There were Unionists in the South, even during the Civil War. This, again, election of 1860. Some of you may have, by now, because of the movie, may have heard about Newton Knight. We have a whole state because they didn't want to secede and be involved in this. It's called West Virginia. You never know that if you go to West Virginia, though. Jeez Louise. And if you wonder if slavery, again, here's some more documentation for you. If you wonder, was slavery really the thing? Well, let's look at the list of the states and when they secede and how. South Carolina is the first one, of course, right after the election. Guess what? 57% of their population are enslaved people. And on down the list. Next up, Mississippi, 55% of their population are enslaved people. I mean, my goodness, the Confederate Constitution makes clear what it was about, as did Alexander Stephens' corner speech. But, here's 3 key articles from the Confederate Constitution that was establishing unequivocally, without apology, that they were establishing a slaveholding republic. They didn't want to be ambiguous about it. They wanted it clear. No bill or attainder ex post facto law or law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed. Period. The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states and shall have the right to transit or sojourn in any state of this Confederacy with their slaves and other property, and the right of the property in said slaves shall not thereby impaired. Shall not be thereby impaired, forgive me. And then there's the big one down here. The Confederate States may acquire new territory. Oh, and there was an expansion plan. Y'all probably never saw that. Probably didn't learn about that. The Confederacy, the American Civil War Museum, my last spot, had this amazing exhibition called Southern Ambitions. that looked at the Confederate government's intent for expansion. They intended to invade Mexico and take over Mexico and Cuba to expand their empire. They had already set up embassies in Brazil, because Brazil was still slaveholding, and partnerships with Brazil. As a matter of fact, some of you may not know, that after the American Civil War, expats of the Confederacy who refused to take the new oath relocated to Brazil. As a matter of fact, every April in Brazil, they have the Parada, is what they call it, the Parada de Confederados, the Parade of the Confederates, to this day. I digress. And Congress shall have the power to legislate and provide governments for the inhabitants of all territories belonging in the Confederate States, lying without the limits of the several states, and may permit them at such times and in such manner as may be by law provide, to form states to be admitted into the Confederacy. In all such territory, the institution of Negro slavery as it now exists in the Confederate States shall be recognized and protected by Congress and by the territorial government. And the inhabitants of several Confederate states and territories shall have the right to take to such territory any slaves lawfully held by them in any of the states or territories of the Confederate States. There's no ambiguity here, folks. But y'all keep talking about states' rights if you want to. And then, what I like to call the first big lie, the lost cause. And I do get how this came into being, considering the significant loss of life during the American Civil War. Considerable. You may have heard the number 620,000 soldiers lost during the American Civil War. Historians have put that number closer to about 750,000. And that does not include any civilian-related death or casualty. So imagine today if we lost 8 million soldiers in a 4-year period. That is the scale of loss for the Civil War generation. For the South, that number is even higher, because about 85% of men between the ages of 15 and I think 40 served in the war. And so the death scale was proportionally higher. So there was significant grief and loss. And if you've spent the last 4 years trying to nation build around the idea that, this is the kind of society that is right, and Jefferson made a mistake, he was wrong, which they said, Jefferson was wrong. All men are not created equal, right? We're actually trying to protect what was originally set up, all those kinds of things. And then all of a sudden, freedom is here. That was a shock to a slavocracy, shock to the system, particularly to the women, right? We grieve, we lose, And so the lost cause was pretty much born fairly quickly. And in fact, Jefferson Davis is one of the first to use that term. He starts laying out the argument as to why it's getting increasingly difficult. And mind you, Jefferson Davis, the Confederate Congress and others tried to overthrow him and unseat him on 3 separate occasions during the Civil War. But, build a statue. The mothers of the lost cause invention are these women, officers of a group that was eventually called the Confederate Memorial Literary Society. These women this group was formed as a follow-up to the various ladies' memorial associations, because here's the thing. The Confederacy did not have a national cemetery system for its military dead. The U.S. did. Oh, here's a little fun fact. I bet you didn't know that Arlington National Cemetery was actually the home of Robert E. Lee. And so when the U.S. government confiscated his property, the commanding officer there decided that he was going to bury American dead soldiers to remind Lee of what he did, not only in violating his oath at the U.S. Military Academy and his service as a U.S. Army officer, but for the lives that he caused. And so he started burying Civil War dead in Lee's backyard. Can you imagine? And that is the origin of our greatest national cemetery. The U.S. did have national cemeteries for its military at the time. There were 13. But these ladies, the Memorial Society in the South, because they didn't have them, the women organized the retrieval of the dead for those who weren't buried on battlefields. They did that, and they raised a little bit of monies that they could, often sending out their slaves to go and retrieve these bodies, really grisly work. Many of the bodies bloated, decomposed, what have you. Whatever little knickknacks were in the pocket that would help identify a soldier, all of that was brought back. And in Virginia, anyway, it was Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond is where they were reinterred or interred. But this happened throughout the South. And so these ladies' memorial associations eventually do join together and become the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And subsequently, the Confederate Memorial Literary Society, during the 100th anniversary period of the U.S. in 1876, formed their organization because they want their dead to be remembered. So these women, Mrs. Bryan, Mrs. Polner, Mrs. Daniel, Mrs. Hutchins, Mrs. Smith, send out a call to women throughout the South. Gather your men's relics and memorabilia and send it to us to Richmond. And they established the Confederate Museum. They also established, they are responsible, the UDC and these ladies' associations are responsible for about 80% of the Confederate monuments that dot the American landscape. And they are grand. Some of them have some really interesting language. They are not harmless. Some of them have really interesting language. And then it came to the school books, because the ladies went a little bit further. Well, actually, they went a lot further, which really impacted us here in Virginia. There was a woman by the name of Mildred Lewis Rutherford, and she was considered the historian of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And she was absolutely adamant that you should reject any textbook or book that says the following: reject a book that calls the Confederate soldier a traitor or rebel, and the war a rebellion, even though the national records call it the War of the Rebellion, right? Throughout the war, it was known as the War of Rebellion. Reject a book that says the South fought to hold her slaves. Reject a book that speaks of the slaveholder of the South as cruel and unjust to his slaves. Reject a textbook that glorifies Abraham Lincoln and vilifies Jefferson Davis. Remember, I just said they tried to unseat him as president 3 times in 4 years. But okay. Unless, here we go, a truthful cause can be found for such glorification and vilification before 1865. Reject a textbook that omits to tell of the South's heroes and their deeds when the North's heroes and their deeds are made prominent. And this became law. Why? Because most education at the time that this is occurring is still in the home. Among communities of wealth, there are private schools and tutors. Even though during Reconstruction, which we were also told because of the lost cause, that Reconstruction was a complete and total failure, Reconstruction was abandoned. Reconstruction gave us an international rail system, or national rail system, gave us public schools, gave us public libraries, expanded the right to vote, expanded the definition of citizenship in the United States, i.e., if you were born here, you are an American. Reconstruction wasn't a failure. Reconstruction was abandoned. The first Ku Klux Klan Act to shut down the rise of the Ku Klux Klan by Nathan Bedford Forrest and his followers. But by the time this is rolled out, and right before, America has decided, and I have to be clear here, white America has decided that the narrative now is a little different. We get into these romanticized brother against brother, right? Whole different meanings start taking shape. And on top of that, like I said, when freedom came, black folks are removed completely from the narrative. And the stereotypes of the free Negro become pervasive. There was a film called Ethnic Notion by an amazing documentary filmmaker named Marlon Riggs back in the early 90s. If you can find it, I highly, highly suggest it. But we get these 6 pervasive stereotypes. The Sambo or the coon, right? It's in our cartoons. It was in film. It was in books. Watermelon, shuffling, stupid, big-lipped, whatever. The Mammy or Aunt Jemima. People got mad because they decided they were going to change the name on a box of pancake mix. Are you serious? But these products and things, though, you got to remember, in that period from roughly like 1890 through the 1950s, truly, symbols of the good old South and happy Negroes and Mammy was considered comforting. Uncle Ben was comforting the white people, whether they were from slaveholding families or not. Because Mammy, which we never think about, Mammy took care of us. Mammy looked after us. Mammy loved us. We loved Mammy. Slavery wasn't so bad, but nobody's thinking about what's happening to Mammy's family. Where are her children? Who's taking care of them? You see where I'm going here? Okay. Uncle Tom is the male version of Mammy, right? From Uncle Remus, I love this one, Stephen, in the totally outrageous Django Unchained, but it was a really interesting take on that character. To the Mandingo or the brute, the sexually ravaging black male with usually a large genitalia. And all he wants to do is rape white women. Then there's the Jezebel. That's the female version. The Sapphire, the angry black woman, which impacts virtually any black woman in professional space. And then, last but not least, the magical Negro. And the magical Negro is the one who is there as the sidekick, the one to help the white person find a deeper level of their humanity. And it's a big trope in popular culture. So, this is one of my favorite characters, too. It's a little hard to take sometimes, I gotta say. I don't know if Boondocks would make it on TV again right now. But there was this wonderful series called Boondocks about 2 little brothers. One was a black revolutionary radical. The other one was this, I don't know how to describe Riley. Riley, his brother, is really into hip-hop culture, pants hanging low, you know, the opposite of his brother in terms of, allegedly the opposite of his brother. And they live with their granddad in suburbia. And so it was a challenge when they got moved from Chicago into suburbia. And one of the things that Riley said many things. but he was always somehow prophetic. He said, I have no patience for white people trying to lecture us on how to respond to oppression in the comfort of their own privilege. And that was before the words of white privilege and all of this. This is a scene from like 10 years ago, before people started freaking out about the terms about white privilege. So now what? As we think about correcting America's historical narrative, why would we want to do that? And I talk about that because, frankly, at least in my job, and my colleagues, many of my colleagues are expressing the same, is that we're getting these phone calls from donors and people and sometimes school teachers. Are you teaching critical race theory? The short answer is, of course not. The long answer is, why are you asking me about a legal theory that's been around for 40 years? What do you really want to know? And the concern is that as marginalized groups, all Americans, but marginalized for generations, have found a collective voice and want their history and their involvement to be reinserted into America's narrative where it should have never been taken out to begin with. Talk about censoring history. To where the accomplishments and the achievements of people of color have been deliberately left out of our textbooks, often deliberately left out of our museums, to reinforce these other narratives. And now are demanding that those narratives come back into play, and then you have to hear things like, you're just revising history. It's revisionist. It's anti-white. It's this, it's that. It's none of those things. It is about correcting the narrative. And you know why? Because we will never get right with each other until we get our history right. We will never be able to address the ills that are consistent in our shared experience if we don't get our history right and be able to address those issues in an honest way. It's like that drunk uncle that you love him. But he's a drunk, he's an alcoholic. You know that. You got one of two choices. You can either ignore him and let the damage continue and be generational, or you can say alcoholism runs in our family and we need to figure out how to make sure it doesn't impact yet another generation. That's what we're talking about here. Let's address the issues so we can get right with our history and get right with each other and be healthy human beings, for God's sake. That's what's been driving me in this work since I first put on a costume at 17. And actually, I was in high school. That was the summer of high school that I got that job. And what was so interesting is that, because a little background about yours truly, I was senior class president, right? I had been on the gymnastics team. I had been a cheerleader. I was National Honor Society. I was all those things. And my friends were like, why is she going to play a slave? Because I loved performance and acting, and I thought, ooh, this is a great acting gig, and they're paying $4.16 an hour? And I'm giving them my age here now, because the minimum wage then was $2.85. So I was going to be making some money. I get to act for the summer. This is a cool gig. Going into it was my thought. After that summer, it completely changed my life. And I grew up in a family where my parents always filled in the historical gap for us. So I knew this history, which is why portraying a slave to me wasn't an insult or some kind of degradation, because I understood from my parents the tenacity, the cultural impact, etc., that my ancestors gave to this nation, even if nobody else got it. I was 17. So now what? We all have work to do. The things that you learned today, the things that you heard today, I hope that you will share with your friends and your colleagues and your circles when these come up. And I know it might not be easy. I know it might not be easy. But these are not made up things. The history and the resources and the art, it's all been there. Yes, and guess what? Each generation asks new questions of the past, because the past is always right in front of us. Always. So on that note, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to thank you all so much for your time and attention, and we will exchange a little bit with some Q&A if you're up for it. Thank you so much. Over here, I can hear you. I got to get to you before she does.
Do you have any tools or tactics that might be helpful when addressing individuals who might bristle up at historical context when discussing their own institutions' tattered past? I work at an independent school, and there are things that just historically line up with the formation. And when I've brought it up, I know how whiteness works, and it starts to bristle. But any insight that you can offer on methods or tactics that can decrease the bristle, because you're always going to be uncomfortable, but anything to offer.
Right. This is something that a lot of institutions are addressing. For those of you who may not have gotten the fullness of the question, she's essentially asking, how do you help an organization or an institution that has a tattered past, meaning it has a past of racism, is where you're going. Just go ahead and say it. It has a past of institutionalized racism, and for whatever reason have now chosen to pretend that that past doesn't exist, right? We're past it. As I was driving here, for example, I was looking at Norfolk Academy. Norfolk Academy was established when Brown v. Board passed, and white families in Norfolk didn't want their children going to public schools anymore. Same thing with Hampton Roads Academy. I mean, it's a part of its past. So how do you help them address it? Well, I mean, again, it's a challenging thing. I think about the conversation that's happening in my home community of Williamsburg. I don't live there anymore, but obviously I work there again now. The elementary school that I went to is called Magruder Elementary School. Magruder Elementary School was built in 1956. All of the schools in York County up to that point had names about their regions. It was York High, it was Grafton High, middle school or elementary. It was about location. Magruder was the first one named specifically for a Confederate, again, after Brown v. Board. But then we were told, oh no, that was for Magruder's 100. Magruder's 100 was named for Magruder, who was stationed there during the Civil War. Oh, right? So what do? I think you have to be bold and brave to ask the question and see where it takes you. And depending on where the resistance or the acceptance is, as you're filling those things out, it makes the conversation move forward. If you are expecting a conversation that may not have emotion involved, I tell people all the time, I experienced this with the Monument Avenue Commission. We are experiencing it now with the University of Richmond, and there are universities around the country that are having these conversations. Georgetown, for example, was able to survive because the priest decided to sell off 200 human beings to pay the bills. It's a part of our collective past, for God's sake. We have got to be able to talk about it. We've got to figure out how do we repair the damage that those actions may have caused. We just have to figure it out. We have to be willing to talk to each other. We have to be willing to give each other some grace, and we have to be able to allow each other to feel it. The rage, I will say this, the rage that I see coming from some white people around again, what they're shadowing behind CRT, critical race theory, which is really not it, is they're afraid of being erased from the narrative. My God, over 30% of Americans' history has been erased from day one. We get it. Now get over yourself, because that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about correcting the narrative. There's two different conversations that are taking place here. And you have to be willing to hear it. Next question. You're welcome.
Hi.
I'm sorry, sir, there's a lady behind you that raised her hand first, and then we'll get to you.
Thank you. I wanted to get your reaction to a project that we've been working on in this area with Reverend Victoria Thomas, to really look at how we could pilot a curriculum that they could offer our shared history in spiritual centers and churches. Since we're not teaching it in schools, whether there's a way that we can come up with a curriculum that churches can be trained and coached on how to offer history, and also tied in with their belief systems. And some of this got started from the book, The Lies
The Lies My Teacher Told Me, by James Lowenthal.
Yeah. So looking at that as a possibility, particularly for my generation, that we can use some of the spiritual centers to train them as a way of doing it. So looking for your reaction and other ways, how do we get this through our system?
I think one of the greatest elements of American culture is the separation of church and state, that everyone has the right of conscience. And so while I absolutely understand historically, and myself having grown up in the church, the Black church in particular has been the wellspring of our community's healing, help, and hope. From a spiritual point of view, as well as from an intellectual point of view, and filling in those gaps. You know, the Black history programs that we had growing up, where we were talking about people that were, not the approved Black people to celebrate, right? And so I think that the role of the church, the Black church, in helping to engage these conversations, I think is very real, and I think that that's something that they can have a conversation with themselves about. Well, I'm getting ready to make a comment about that. One of the bravest things that I've seen in Richmond was St. Paul's Episcopal Church. St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond is one of the oldest Episcopal churches and dioceses. Its history and culture is deeply entrenched around, and they built sort of deeply entrenched around the Confederacy. They're stained glass, venerated Confederate heroes as if they were biblical figures. And that church went through a period of about 3 years where they went through their historical records of the church and the things that they did as a church. They are a far more contemporary church today. I mean, obviously, since they went through this process. But they lost some members in that process, too. But the church as a whole needed this to heal and for itself figure out, how do we continue to repair the damage that may have been caused and was caused by the actions of this church on this community. And they have invested in that, not just in talk, but in work and in deed and in wallet. And it is a beautiful thing. So my point is, the role of faith communities is important. And let's not forget our Muslim communities. Did you know South Carolina's enslaved population, actually portions of North Carolina, but particularly South Carolina, 1 in 5 enslaved people in the Carolinas were Muslim. And, we want to act like Islam is something new and radical and whatever. It's not. It has also been on these shores for a really long time. So much so that Jefferson acquired a Quran. So my point is this. We have, again, been diverse. We all have contributed to the American ideal and ideology and practice. But we all have not been given credit for our impacts in slavery, in freedom, in unfreeness, in segregation, in whatever it is. There have always been voices As Mr. Rogers used to say, I loved Mr. Rogers, always look for the helpers because they were always there, even when we were being our ugliest. And I believe that the helpers are still here now. And I think that there's more of us. Last question. This gentleman here, I think. Oh, okay, I go. I'll hang out if you want to hang out. Okay, all right, great.
Perhaps you answered the question already or began to answer it. And my question was, what makes you hopeful in this moment? But it seems to me that I found that I was very hopeful when I saw what Stacey Abrams did in Georgia with regard to getting out the vote. And I am so discouraged now by seeing the effort in so many states to roll back that vote. And that scares me. And I just wonder what it is that makes you hopeful in this moment in time.
In this moment in time, I will give you two responses. The public historian in me knows that this is cyclical. Whenever there have been periods of expansion of American rights and ideals, as we've had for the last 50 years, whenever there's been an expansion, there's always been a very rapid and violent reaction to that. Think of it as a rubber band, if you will. We've stretched for the last 50 years. And what we're experiencing is, right? And it's quick and it's violent and it feels horrible. But guess what? The rubber band is not the same size it was before. So that's a point of hope. I see the pattern and I'm like, okay, generally these, and I'm saying conservative not in a political sense, but just in a sort of general sense. The conservative backlash is really a part of a cycle. Sometimes the cycles are longer, like it was after the expansive progressive period that was Reconstruction, and the snapback was severe and lasted for almost another 100 years. And then we had this 50 years of expansion. So my expectation is not that we get 50 years of the backlash, but instead the period is shorter, right? It's a shorter period. So that's where that level of hope comes from. And then I have to admit, there's the other side of me that's more personal, is cautiously optimistic. Because I also know that there is a political element to this. For example, night before last in Texas, you're talking about rolling back voting rights. Texas, as they're redrawing their districts, Texas' white population is 40%. They just redrew the district to give majority, 59% of their districts to white voters. 30-some% of its population are people of African descent. I'm sorry, of Latino or Latinos, have 12% representation. African Americans now only have 3% representation because of the way they have now gerrymandered Texas in the middle of the night. They passed this at 3:30 in the morning, by the way, 2 nights ago. The question will be whether or not people in the state of Texas who are opposed to this are going to put forth the legal challenge, because clearly this is racially motivated districting. So, how that will play out is going to be really interesting. And there's concern about a similar move afoot here in Virginia, and why there's the clashes between the redistricting for Virginia, which probably will end up going to the court, because I'm not sure they're going to be able to work it out. So that's sort of my cautiously optimistic, because once you put sort of legal things in place, and given where our Supreme Court is now, my expectation is that some of these laws we may be stuck with, especially since the Justice Court struck down many of the provisions of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. And when that happened, people weren't paying attention. And I was like, oh, this is not going to be good. And it took less than 10 years for this to play out. So, but again, I believe in people like Stacey Abrams. But I know she's not the only one. She just took the coordinated effort that it took to keep her from winning, because she would have won. I mean, they pulled everything. I mean, it would have been close. It was certainly close anyway. But man, oh man. You know? So we just, and it's not just in the southern states anymore, right? This ideology is everywhere. We're seeing it in the Midwest. We're seeing it in the Northwest. It's just, like I said, it's a period of snapback. And we just have to see how long this cycle is going to take. I hope that it will only be about 5 to 7 years, but that's a long time. That's a long time. I'm just telling you, I want to be wrong. But y'all better get your butts out to vote if you want it to be any different. That's all I could say. Yes, sir. Last question.
Christy, I hope I can call you Christy.
Certainly.
I believe you co-chaired the Richmond Monument Avenue Commission that I think was commissioned by Mayor Stoney. That was 2017, is that about right?
Yes, sir.
And I took a quick look on the internet the other day. It's a great, really a great report that you all, after about over a year of work, I think, with a lot of input from all segments of the Richmond community. And I'm just assuming that the mandate was to try to come up with what to do with those monuments on Monument Avenue. Is that basically the...
Okay, so yeah, after a lot of work went into that commission. A lot of conversations, lots of letters. Yeah, so our recommendations, is that what you're asking me?
Well, I was going to ask you basically, just describe briefly the work of the commission, and I think it was composed basically of, 5 prominent African Americans, 5 prominent whites, and from all historians, etc., from all aspects of Richmond society, and the work, just describe briefly the work that was done, and the recommendations that you came up with.
Sure, I mean, in brief, so it started off a hot mess, right? I mean, when the mayor put together this commission that was ethnically and racially diverse and gender diverse, when he put together the commission, and I was actually a co-chair, my co-chair was Dr. Greg Kimball from the Library of Virginia. He wanted us to, we were organized in June of 2017, and he wanted us to issue a report by November 1 of 2017, right? Yeah, right. So the initial idea is we'd have a couple public meetings. We had set up a website where people could send in letters, and of course lots of letters were coming in. We had reviewed those letters, and we were categorizing the sentiments of those letters so we could track that. And the first meeting was a mess. People came yelling, screaming, had their signs. I mean, it was tear them down, save our monuments. It was horrible. I wasn't there at that very first meeting. I was watching it live streamed on Facebook because I had just had an emergency medical procedure. So I'm laying on my couch and I'm going, no, oh, Greg, come on. And I'm trying to text him and get control of the meeting. But that needed to happen. That vent needed to happen. And then that Wednesday night that we did that following Saturday was the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And the death of Heather Heyer. And so Richmond was like, the whole country actually was aghast. But in Richmond, people were like, oh no, we don't want that here. And so we decided to postpone and then allow ourselves time to meet with communities and constituencies about how best to conduct our work. And that's what made our commission different. We actually set up these small work group things and ask the community, how do you think community engagement should be, and who should be involved, and how should we set up the meetings, and how should we conduct research, and oh, you want to know more information about the history? Okay, and we got the cultural community and the universities involved. And so we had this, by the time it was all said and done, and we then were able to have the next course of meetings, the exchanges were, people were still, you know, in their positions, but they were more willing to hear some pretty evocative stories. The rest of it is really simple. The commission had 4 recommendations, because we had to address what the state law wouldn't let us do at that time. We had to address for Richmond, it was a considerable number of people, percentage-wise, who wanted the monuments removed. But that was not an option under state law at the time. And we had to address it because it was coming up in virtually every meeting we had. And so the 4 recommendations were as follows. We recommended that Richmond unify with other municipalities throughout the state to gain community control around monuments. We weren't saying take them down. We're saying let each community decide for itself what it wants. Communities put them up. They ought to be able to decide what happens to them, right? That was number 1. Number 2 was engage with the artistic and creative communities about ways that they can be recontextualized, or new monuments or new things put in place to help them tell a new story. The 3rd recommendation was to take down Jefferson Davis. Now that was one, it was really interesting. The Confederate descendant groups, I think, threw him as a bone. You know, we really, really like him that much. You can take him down, right? You know, it was kind of interesting, right? He became their sacrificial lamb. But on Monument Avenue, the Jefferson Davis Monument was by far the most egregious and the most explicit about lost cause ideology. And then the 4th recommendation was signage, or contextualization of the existing ones. And so those were the recommendations. What I find interesting is that all 4 of those things came to pass. Perhaps not how we perceived them, but they did come to pass. For example, artists definitely reconfigured the Lee Monument. Say what you will, oh, it's just graffiti, it's ugly art. That is the most profound piece of protest art in the world. If you did not have a chance to go and look at the pedestal and the statements and the things that were happening, it wasn't just about the pedestal. It was the circle that was put around it. They renamed it Marcus David Peters Circle. They had massage therapists and musicians, and they had basketball set up. They were reclaiming a part of the community that they were never allowed to be in. Even though those laws are gone now, for Black Richmond, you don't go into Monument Avenue. You don't go into the museum district, because somebody going to call the cops on you because they figure you don't belong. Think about that for a minute. So they did that. There was another group that did the signage, and they put up these signs, and they were brilliant. When I first saw them, I was like, ooh, who did this? I don't remember being in, they were brilliant. Historical referencing for each of the monuments. But that was created by a group, a group of people who wanted to create that signage. Jefferson Davis definitely came down. Again, my concern, and we kept saying it in the meetings, I was like, look, y'all, you don't want to try to pull down Lee or Jackson. I'm telling you, they're huge and they weigh a lot, and you're going to die. I mean, I just said you're going to die. If you think you're going to put a rope around that and pull it down, you're going to die. You know? But the community did choose to do that. They brought down Jeff Davis. And then last but certainly not least, the state law changed, giving local control to communities to determine the fate of this. So What happens next to Monument Avenue is really, I don't have any idea. That is, as I've said to many who's like, well, Christy, aren't you gonna? I was like, look, I am commuting 2.5 hours every day to go to JYF and do my job there. Richmond area is still where I and my family choose to live, but I cannot be engaged in this next phase. It's time for others to do the work. Y'all figure out together. This movement, sprung from oppression, sprung from Black Lives Matter. This movement of this multi-ethnic, multi-generational movement for social justice and a reckoning with the past. There's a whole new group of an energy there. Let them figure out together what Monument Avenue looks like in conjunction with the people who live there. And so it's going to be interesting to see what evolves. Everything has been, I've heard everything from actually renaming the circle, but that's state property, so it's kind of going to be kind of interesting. Renaming that Marcus David Peters Circle and putting a fountain there. I've heard other statuary going in place, but statuary is really expensive. I've heard a variety of things, but I'm going to be really interested to see what evolves there, because the historic designation isn't going away. History happened on Monument Avenue again, and it will, I think, be better for the city in the long term in terms of figuring out. Now, mind you, Richmond still has over 100 other Confederate monuments around the city. Right? Fortunately, the majority of them are in cemeteries, so nobody's interested in bothering any of those. But there are still a few that are on a landscape. And like A.P. Hill is right in a traffic circle, and he's actually buried there with his wife. So they're definitely not going to touch that until they can make arrangements to reinter him. And I think they have made arrangements with the Hill family to relocate him. So, it's going to be interesting. Definitely interesting. Again, thank you all so much. I have way overexceeded my time. Your patience has been greatly appreciated. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you again very much for being here. If we have upcoming programs, if you aren't on our mailing list, please get on our mailing list. And one more time, it's been 2 years, but it's been far too long since we've had you here. Would you join me in thanking him? Thanks.